LitRPG is a very broad genre. Much like the general label of fantasy, it fits a huge variety of stories with their own conventions. Unlike many fantasy genres like high fantasy or sword and sorcery, which are mostly defined by either themes, scope, and story convention, LitRPG is often more concerned by certain world-building tropes and the nature of its power systems, which makes perfect sense for a genre founded on the implementation of game mechanics. And perhaps the strongest example of this is the dungeon crawl genre. The genre is strongly inspired by the 1997 video game Dungeon Keeper and the many games that followed it. It also draws heavily on tabletop RPGs and the experience of being a dungeon master in games like Dungeons & Dragons, setting up challenges for the players. While modern D&D is usually far more of a collaborative storytelling experience, older modules like the Tomb of Horrors feature a dangerous and difficult dungeon for player characters to overcome or die trying. These sources further shape many popular MMO games with their dungeon raids, which then fed back into LitRPG. With these inspirations in mind, the dungeon crawl genre sets out to tell a story from a perspective of what would otherwise be a feature of a game rather than a character, the dungeon itself as a living being, controlling its own shape and the monsters within. Much of LitRPG focuses on specific characters and their adventures. The genre is called LitRPG, or literary role-playing game after all, and provides the experience of a player in a perfectly immersive game. Meanwhile, dungeon crawl is more about running an immersive game, growing into the perfect death trap or perfect challenge. Put simply, dungeon crawl is a genre that follows the sentient heart of a dungeon as it grows, manages itself, and deals with intruders. Cores will be able to change or expand their layout over time, adding rooms that serve different functions and spawning monsters and traps to defend themselves or their treasures. The basic appeal of the genre is in seeing what kind of dungeon the core builds and how it deals with intruders. The titular core of a dungeon is what separates it from similar ideas and brings in the LitRPG elements. The main character having some kind of base and occasionally needing to defend it is hardly a new concept. Both in novels and tabletop RPGs, base building has been a feature for a long time, and filling that base with traps and minions is obvious. But a core turns a dungeon from a location into an entity in its own right. The core is a sentient creature and the dungeon around it its body. Dungeon cores are almost always immobile and limited to interacting directly only with the things that enter their dungeon. Their only direct impact on the world outside is claiming more of it as they grow. What purpose this growth serves is one of the first questions to answer when looking at a dungeon core. Generally, there are three variations. First, dungeons are living beings like any other and seek to grow simply because that's what life does. In fantasy worlds with treants, mimics, and all manner of living objects, a living building is hardly that out of place. These ones are usually the ones with the least constraints, but may also have the least system-granted powers. Then there are dungeons that are part of how the world works. They are a feature of the LitRPG system just like classes and levels. Some LitRPG have similar things like event bosses, quests, or special zones where dangerous and valuable monsters spawn. The dungeon is similar, but perhaps a little more intricate to interact with since a mind is guiding it. Having a specific purpose as part of a system comes with powers to fulfill that purpose, but often also restrictions not to go beyond it. Finally, there are the dungeons that are deliberate creations. The tools of powerful mages, weapons of great nations, or even challenges placed by the gods, though that last one could fall into the second category. These dungeons may have the least resemblance to the classic image of an underground labyrinth filled with treasure. Practically speaking, they often function as a sort of mage focused on summoning and defense. The dungeon's origin and purpose will obviously greatly affect the sort of story that is likely to be told about it. A dungeon that is part of the world's function or a place for heroes to test themselves is less likely to be in danger of destruction and can focus on its internal management. A dungeon as a regular living being, on the other hand, is in a race to grow too strong to raid before something powerful comes along and tries. Whether attacks are likely also depends on a dungeon's purpose and abilities, since it will determine whether there is treasure inside. System-spawned dungeons are often forced to create treasure for adventurers to loot. In all of this, I haven't talked much about the physical core itself. Usually it is a rather simple object. A large crystal sphere that houses the dungeon's consciousness. Destroying it generally means the dungeon's death. Non-human protagonists are generally uncommon in any genre. Even fantasy, with its many fictional races like elves and dwarves, still limits itself to the mostly humanoid. Lizardmen and the like are as far as most go. As such, a floating orb is pretty out there, even for LitRPG, which features the whole subgenre of monster evolution. With that in mind, it's no surprise that people have sought to make more recognizable characters for dungeon core stories. Many cores will at some point construct an avatar or possess a minion to serve as their body, relegating the core to something akin to a lich's phylactery. Otherwise, there's also the dungeon master. Instead of a thinking dungeon, there is a thinking being that is bound to or claim control of the dungeon core. Ultimately, it doesn't change too much about the story beyond removing a barrier of interaction between the dungeon and the world. A deal breaker for some readers and irrelevant for others. The nature of a dungeon and a core represents a few unique challenges to telling a story set there. The first I've already mentioned, familiarity. While the people who enjoy unusual protagonists and non-human or humanoid characters tend to really enjoy them, they are in a clear minority. There's a reason why surveys in games like Dungeons & Dragons show humans to be the most common choice despite the many options available. The audience is human and has a far easier time getting attached to and invested in a human character. A dungeon core isn't remotely humanoid, and by its nature is reactive, waiting for others to enter the dungeon, which interferes with a lot of common storylines. Dungeon avatars and masters can alleviate this somewhat, but will put off the people who love the core concept, so an author needs to consider how much they want to commit to the idea and where the strengths of their story lie. Since protagonists who spend a lot of their time alone are far more common in LitRPG to begin with, the isolation and strangeness of a dungeon core is less of an issue. But LitRPG also thrives on steady progression and regular high-action fight scenes. The dungeon core does not lend itself that well to these ideas, so something, usually base building and repelling invaders, has to take their place. Which leads to the other two issues presented by invaders: power levels and stakes. Being stationary, the dungeon is entirely at the mercy of the outside world in terms of what challenges it faces. That means the story needs to justify why no one far too powerful for the dungeon shows up, or if they do, why they don't destroy it or take control of the entrance. Readers rarely enjoy seeing the main character lose agency, but if a dungeon is a resource, people will be motivated to monopolize it. Other genres also see characters want control over certain resources or locations, but in a dungeon core story the character is the resource and location, and that is a dynamic that needs to be kept in mind. If a dungeon core is not wanted, or is but the people attacking it will destroy it should they succeed, that presents its own storytelling issues. Every encounter is incredibly high stakes, a battle for survival that the characters cannot prevent, flee from, or even talk their way out of. Constant high stakes battles will end up lowering the stakes if there isn't any variety or extra motivations, as the reader grows desensitized to it. And variety can be unexpectedly hard to achieve. Remodeling the dungeon or changing up the traps and monsters is most of what a core can do for variety. That works, but it doesn't have the same impact that new skills or abilities in regular LitRPG has, where the fights are more up close and dynamic. And due to the system laying out exactly what characters can do and usually how well they can do it, it becomes harder to give the core freedom in how it shapes the dungeon. There have to be carefully considered constraints because of how easily perfect terrain can throw off any sort of power scaling. None of this is impossible to overcome, of course. In fact, some of these restrictions lead to the things that make dungeon core stories so interesting, shifting focus to preparation and building over figuring out maneuvers and counters mid-battle. For authors used to writing more standard LitRPG, that can be a considerable shift. With a few warnings out of the way, let's talk about the dungeon's systems. As stated, a dungeon's basic features include a core, the structure around it, monsters, and traps. Each of these have plenty of variety though. The types of core I've already covered. The structure of a dungeon is one of the things that has the strongest conventions and yet some of the most variety. With the influence dungeon cores draw from, like Dungeon Keeper and D&D, there's a strong association with square and rectangular corridors and rooms made of stone. The walls and floors are often magically reinforced and very hard to damage, if not outright unbreakable. But the genre has evolved a lot from those roots, and several types of dungeon are now popular. Broadly though, there are underground dungeons, either spreading into natural-looking caves or classic stonework, or there are above-ground dungeons, which pretty much exclusively grow into towers. Some other types may exist, but if it's above ground, it's almost always a tower with the core at the top. Within the dungeon, the rooms either serve as places to put traps and monsters, or if a dungeon has an aspect of resource management, then special features and workshops for minions to work in can be placed here. What exactly goes into those rooms and the overall look of the dungeon can be determined with a theme. Themes are almost like classes for dungeons and narrow down what kind of features and monsters the dungeon has access to or is best at using. For example, a fairy theme encourages rooms with forests, flower fields, or magic circles. Meanwhile, a demon theme might see fire, brimstone, and sacrificial altars. Monsters are similar and are usually even more heavily restricted. In fact, in dungeons that use themes, the theme is usually a type of monster with terrain following suit, rather than the other way around. Where monsters come from will affect whether the theme is a limit or a boost to them. Monsters can be spawned in by the dungeon deliberately, either summoned or created from a set the core has access to. They may also spawn naturally without deliberate effort from the core, which means less control for it. Or monsters can enter the dungeon from outside. Again, this can be natural as they are drawn to a suitable environment, or a deliberate act by the core as it captures or tames them. Whether monsters in a dungeon respawn is a huge aspect of what kind of stakes a fight will hold for the core. Being a structure, the dungeon tends to favor defense, and with respawning monsters holds an edge in battles of attrition. At least until the foes leave and come back with a bigger army, since the core can't run in the meantime. That's just one more reason why it's important for an author to think about the dungeon's purpose and its relation to the outside world and what kind of story they want to tell. Certain dungeon types are just inherently at odds with certain plotlines. Traps are a very tricky one, as their power can scale from irrelevant to completely overbearing very quickly. If a dungeon has perfect control in how it shapes itself, it can create impassable routes or extremely deadly traps very easily. It is therefore not uncommon for control to be limited. Traps may not be offered at all or be limited to a selection with no customization. Should an author include trap features, it is worth thinking carefully about how strong they are and whether the story expects people to have any chance of challenging the dungeon. In this instance, classic D&D can be a great source of inspiration. A final point of note is growth. Leveling up is a rather core feature to much of LitRPG, and while dungeon cores often don't have traditional leveling, they still experience growth. The core is generally limited to expanding the dungeon by having minions dig, or by slowly growing an invisible area of influence. Instead of levels, new features are unlocked based on dungeon size or resources gathered. Leveling up is still an option, of course, with regular incursions to provide XP. Authors should consider how fast a dungeon expands, as not considering the full implications can quickly lead to a core growing into a living kingdom unintentionally. More than most LitRPG main characters, a dungeon core is defined by its opposition. A regular MC gets stronger and seeks out challenges or interests. They are defined by their own skills, stats, and abilities. A dungeon core is too, but there is a strong focus on what shows up at the dungeon store. It's the difference between tailoring a build and seeking out foes to test it against, and getting attacked and making choices in response. Dungeons have to build a so-called all-comers list, a setup that holds against whatever is thrown at it. That, combined with base building aspects, the non-human main character, and the more niche inspirations compared to other LitRPG, puts dungeon cores in a unique position. Its audience is looking for something similar but different to the standard power or progression fantasy. It's the type of person that looks at a game and thinks it would be cool to be the game master rather than a player, or the type that loves to get a peek behind the curtain and see how the whole thing was set up. Writing a story in such a genre isn't particularly harder or easier than in any other genre, but does require a little forethought. You can drop an isekai protagonist into a new world with a system and figure things out as they go, simply because it's a regular person that just needs to make their way through the world. Assuming they have any drive at all beyond their immediate needs, plot will more or less happen to them, as many people who consider themselves discovery writers find. With its all-or-nothing stakes and naturally feast or famine style of progression, dungeon cores have to be managed a little more carefully to get a coherent story out of them. Many such stories end up thriving on their side characters and a more episodic here's the next problem between periods of downtime sort of style. Shows like Star Trek Deep Space Nine evoke a similar structure, featuring a main location for the cast that they, except under special circumstances, can't abandon. This look into dungeon cores has, I think, featured less advice and options than I usually like to give, but I think that's a necessity for a genre like this. Much like the very broad genres like mystery or romance, deciding that you're writing a dungeon core story only gives an author a few guidelines and audience expectations to fulfill. Without knowing the exact story they want to tell, there's very little concrete advice to be given. So I will simply say that dungeon core is a genre that I have enjoyed greatly, and that I greatly encourage interested authors to explore what it has to offer and its wide range of influences, from single-player video games to MMOs to tabletop RPGs.